I've spent the last few weeks trying out the Haida M10 filter system, and in my mind it is one of the best filter systems currently on the market. A few months back I reviewed the Nissi V5 Pro, and overall I was fairly impressed with it, but there were one or two severe drawbacks, most notable of which was the amount of additional flaring that this produced when it was mounted on your lens. Now, the Haida M10 not only solves this problem, but it also addresses issues with the Nissi that I hadn't even realised at the time. The first and most obvious is just how much smaller the case is to carry this thing around in. You obviously ideally don't want the whole filter system just clanging around loose in your bag, you want it stored securely. But even though the footprint of these is about the same, that extra depth of the Nissi just makes it that little bit more inconvenient to stick in your bag. So why is the Haida so much thinner than the Nissi? Well, there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, straight out of the box, the V5 Pro has slots for 3 filters at the front, whereas the Haida only has slots for 2. Which isn't really a problem for me, because at no point have I ever needed more than 2 drop-in filters for any shot that I've ever taken with these. But if you are someone who's ever needed 3 filters for a shot, don't fear, because in the box you get an additional plate and the required screws and screwdriver. So you would take out all these screws, you would put the 3rd plate on top, and you would use the longer screws and put them back on. Easy peasy. But straight out of the box, the Haida works for me. The next is the number of required components and the complexity of getting these onto your camera. You see, with the Nissi system, you've got your front section where your filters hold on to, you've got an adapter plate that connects into the back of it, and this by default lets you mount onto a lens with an 82mm front filter. But none of my lenses are 82mm, so then you require a step-down ring. So to get this onto my 16-35, for example, which is my general go-to landscape lens, I'd need the 72-82mm step-down ring. I'd then need to screw on the adapter ring onto that, and then stick the square holder onto the front. So that's 3 components just to get filters on the front. The Haida does away with this adapter ring, so you just have the square filter holder and then the required adapter ring that mounts straight onto it. So adapter ring straight onto the lens, and then square filter on, jobs are good. Now, the reason why the Nissi has this additional adapter ring was a neat little feature that I was impressed with when I reviewed it, but the Haida does it better. So this is actually to mount a polarizing filter onto. So the circular polarizer fits onto the adapter ring, which then sits behind all of your drop-in filters, and there's a little wheel that lets you spin this independently. So whereas some filter systems you would have to drop a square polarizing plate in and then turn the whole system, this lets you do them independently of each other, which is great. The drawback to this, however, which I hadn't factored in when I reviewed it, is if you have all this set up, square filters and a polarizer behind, and you then decide that you don't want the polarizer in place, you need to take the square filters out to then unscrew the polarizer and then put your filters back in. Can be a bit of a nuisance. The Haida, by comparison, has the same facility of putting filters in behind the filters, but does it in a better way. So there's a little drop-in slot that sits in behind here. As standard, it comes with just a hollow blanking plate, so it fills in this gap so you don't get any light leakage. But you can drop in a circular polarizer like the Nissi, but it just drops straight in and then the wheel on the top lets you spin it. Or you can even go as so far as to drop in an ND filter. And there are quite a range of these filters available, so various strength ND filters, circular polarizing filters, and I believe there is even a light pollution filter as well. Now, I love using really strong ND filters because it lets you get really long exposures and creates a lot of blur. Now, obviously, with a conventional square filter, you can get those ND filters that go into the front. The downside I've found sometimes is they can be a little bit stiff to get in. You risk knocking a grad filter out of place if you've got one of them as well. With this, however, it's so much easier. You can just set up your grad filters how you want, drop this in behind without touching the others, hey presto. And then if you change your mind and you want to swap the grad for the polarizer, or you don't want any filter at all, you can just remove one cartridge, replace it with another, so much quicker than with the V5 Pro. Now the V5 Pro does feel quite weighty because it's pretty much entirely made out of metal. Now the Haida system does, for the most part, feel like it's made of metal as well. There might be some elements of plastic in here, but it still feels particularly well made. It's got a foam strip on the bottom that's going to help protect if it starts banging into anything on the floor. And I also like the inclusion of this little foam ring around the edge that's going to stop additional light leakage. And speaking of light leakage, as I said at the start, my biggest gripe of the V5 Pro when I reviewed it was the ridiculous amount of additional flaring that was caused. And I believe this is because of just how glossy and shiny the material is that Nissi have used. I mean, just look how reflective that is against the light. So any light that doesn't make it directly down the lens is going to hit all of this, get reflected back into your filters, and then potentially go back down into your lens and cause the flaring. The Haida, by comparison, isn't as reflective, and as a result, when I've been testing this, has created no additional flaring at all. And when shooting with this with my widest available focal length of 16mm, I spotted no vignetting caused by this either. Now, Haida did also include one of their grad filters for me to test out as well, but I'm not going to talk about that in this video. I'm going to do a separate video further down the line where I compare up various different brands of grad filters to see if there's any real difference. But let's talk price, because the Haida is more expensive than the Nissi. On B&H at the moment, the Nissi is currently retailing at $137, including the circular polarizer. Whereas the same setup in the Haida of the filter holder and adapter ring and the drop-in polarizer is $195. So you're looking about $60 more for the M10 versus the V5. But in my mind, the Haida is a far superior setup to the Nissi and well worth the additional money. Even if you don't mind the additional size and the additional weight and the extra time to put all of this together, and then the hassle of taking it all apart again to add or remove the polarizer, it's still worth the extra $60 to have a system that doesn't add a ton of unwanted flaring to your pictures. But what do you make of these filter systems? Which would you choose? Would you choose the Haida M10? Would you choose the Nissi? Or would you pick something else? And if so, what? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.